When I think of whistleblowers, I think of Karen Silkwood. I think of Aaron Brockovich. I think of Daniel Ellsberg. And the difference between them and the UAP whistleblowers is pretty easy. All of those that I mentioned, there was documentation. In the case of Silkwood, we had the radioactive material. In the case of Brockovich, they had the poisonous materials. And Ellsberg, we actually had the documents. We don't have any of that with the whistleblowers. We have claims, we have stories, we have whistleblowers who say that they've seen pieces of whatever, or they've been in a skiff or whatever where this has been discussed. We don't have anything that's accessible. So that's a big difference. And I don't even like using the term whistleblower when I think of the UAP, because these are people who are making claims that can't be verified. Now, does that mean they're lying? No. What it tells us is, maybe there's a different process involved, but we just don't have enough information.
When people think about UFOs, they think Roswell, Area 51, and the Pentagon. But Canada has its own remarkable history with the phenomena. Chris Rutkowski is one of Canada's best-known UFO researchers. With degrees in astronomy and education, he's investigated reports since the 1970s and coordinates the Canadian Sky Survey, which is the country's most comprehensive catalogue of UFO sightings. He's written 11 books on UFOs and unexplained phenomena, advised filmmakers and journalists around the whole world, and his latest project, the documentary Strangeness Index, brings decades of Canadian casework to the screen. Chris Rutkowski, happy Canada Day, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, and thank you for recognizing Canada Day. And it's the Canadian UFO Survey, not the Sky Survey. And in Canada, we still call them UFOs. The Canadian government still refers to UFO rather than UAP. So we just want to get that little dig in right there, right at the top.
Sure. That's totally fair to get. And I like that you're keeping it OG with the UFO, because we all mean UFO when we say UAP anyway,
exactly,
right?
Yeah.
So when people think of UFOs, Chris, they immediately, think of Roswell and Area 51 and all that. But Canada's got its own long history. If you were introducing someone to the Canadian UFO story for the first time, where would you begin?
Well, that's a really hard question because there's so many ways you could go with this. First of all, Canada is partnered with NORAD with the United States. So it's sort of been hand in hand with the Pentagon and military stuff all along. And Canada, of course, has had its own UFO investigation projects. Even as recently as this past year, there was a program and a release from the Office of Canada's Chief Science Advisor, who reports directly to the Prime Minister regarding how Canada's UFO research should go moving forward, what should be done next. And you've had cases all along. You mentioned the Falcon Lake case. That's just one of many remarkable cases that have had American connections. Of course, because the Condon Committee had sent somebody up to investigate the Falcon Lake case. And the United States Air Force Project Blue Book has many, many Canadian cases in its files. So, we really have been part and parcel with anything in North America and have, stood on our own for quite some time.
Amazing. And Chris, I'm Canadian. Obviously, I'm up here near Toronto. And, the U.S. has Ross Coulthart, Jeremy Corbell, George Knapp. There's all of these figures in the U.S. who are really prominent in terms of the UFO topic. And for me in Canada, it's always you, right? You're the person who's on our national news here, right? Talking about these things. So, you've really become synonymous with the topic here in Canada. And I wanted to just ask you, how did you get pulled into the subject?
Well, it started a long time ago, and I'm really, really old, so they have to go really far back. I actually was on News Nation before Ross Coulthart, by the way, just so I point that out. But it goes back to the 70s when I was taking my astronomy degree, and there were a lot of UFOs being reported in Canada around that time. And my professors in astronomy were not crazy about the whole UFO thing. Oh, it's nonsense, and it's people are seeing spots before their eyes and all this sort of stuff. And I was in my professor's office one day, and he had a phone call from somebody reporting a UFO, and he was really annoyed because it was detracting from his important work. And I said, well, the next time a call comes in, just talk to me. I'm going to be probably studying just around the corner from your office. And by golly, he started doing that. And I ended up talking to people who had seen UFOs and wanted to speak to somebody who had seen it, and reporting it to the university seemed the most logical place. I ended up talking with people by visiting them at their farms, at their homes, throughout the countryside. And I, figured this was a good way to get on my professor's good side, which was all right. Although after about a year and a half or so, somebody in the physics department heard I was doing this, and they had a cancellation for one of the visiting professors giving a talk. And they said, well, why don't you tell people what you found out about UFOs? And unusual for an undergrad at that time to give a presentation to the physics department. But I said, okay, and they arranged it and advertised it. But the day before I was supposed to speak, they came to me and they said, well, unfortunately, words got around that you're going to be speaking about UFOs. And so we've had to move your talk to the largest lecture hall in the entire university. And oh, by the way, the TV cameras will be coming, and I think the newspapers will be there.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. So like 500 people listened to me talk about what I had found out about UFOs. That was my baptism by fire, and it hasn't really stopped.
Wow. And what year was that?
That was the year the presentation was 1977, I think.
Year I was born. It was a good year.
I read that you had people like Hynek and Stanton Friedman staying at your house at one point. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I because I was getting into it and I wanted to learn more and approach it from a scientific point of view. So I, reached out to, as many people as I could. And at that time, Stanton Friedman was going from college to college universities in both the United States and Canada, giving presentations. And as it turned out that he had given a presentation at the university that I was at. And when he came in, he's a little cheap. I think I can say that, and said, they're giving me a per diem and some money for a hotel, but is there any place I could stay where I could pocket the money? I said, you can stay with me, and he ended up coming and staying with me, and he slept on my couch. And when Hynek came through, he wanted to set up, at that time the Center for UFO Studies had already been created, and he wanted to set up a Canadian version of the Center for UFO Studies. And when he had come to Manitoba, I met with him and a number of scientists in the physics department. They were delighted to see another physicist. He ended up sleeping at my place between flights and, getting to know him. Over the years, I got to know him. I spent, I think it was, for what year that was, that we had a solar eclipse up here, and he came with his family, and we all, watched the solar eclipse from Gimli, Manitoba, and we kept in touch with him.
Wow. And that was, was that Hynek, did you say?
That was Hynek, yeah.
Wow.
And Stan and I kept in touch, and, we continued to visit each other back and forth. I was one of the few who actually visited him at his home in New Brunswick. There's a classic photo that you might have seen of him surrounded by a mountain of papers and files. I took that photo when I was in his basement.
Oh, cool.
His wife got mad that I took that photo. She didn't want people to see it. But yeah, we had a good relationship. So I got it from a number of different directions.
Wow, that is so cool. That's really cool. Okay, we're going to switch gears. We're going to jump into one of Canada's most well-known cases that you've obviously written about, so you know a lot about, the Falcon Lake Incident. I mean, anybody who's studied the subject of UFOs likely already knows about this case, but you are the authority here in Canada, and I would love to hear, your summarization of it for the audience, just in case they aren't aware of that.
Sure. Well, the Falcon Lake case is a classic, and it has all the elements you would really want in a UFO case. And I don't say that lightly because, people think of Roswell and, some of these other big name cases. But Falcon Lake, we have everything. We have the government documents. We have the witness who I interviewed many times. There was physical evidence at the site. There was radiation found at the site. There were medical records. I mean, it really doesn't stop with what happened. Because in May of 1967, a fellow by the name of Stefan Mihalik, who's sort of an amateur rock hound, he had taken the bus out to Falcon Lake, which is a sort of a provincial park right on the edge of Manitoba and Ontario, if anybody knows where those are. And he went into the forest around 6 o'clock in the morning, and he was sort of looking for some rock, specifically some quartz, because there are some gold mines a little bit further north of there. And he was, trying to strike his fortune, or just interested in rocks in general. He'd already staked some claims, as a matter of fact, for some, I think, some copper and possibly some silver. So he's looking for some nice quartz veins around lunchtime, bright sunny day. He stops next to a rock, and his attention was suddenly attracted because he was on a sort of a rocky promontory overlooking a beaver dam and a little pond, and the geese suddenly took off. They were frightened by something, and he thought, oh no, there's a bear around, and there really are bears there, so he had to be a little careful. And his attention was drawn to these two objects that were in the sky, very, very bright, very, very shiny. And they descended slowly towards the ground, and one happened to keep on descending further and further and further down, and appeared to land on a flat rock outcropping not too far away from him. And it looked like a standard Hollywood-style flying saucer, disc shape with a dome, light coming out of it. And he was trying to figure out what this was. And the problem is that, he knew what aircraft looked like. He had actually been in the military in Eastern Europe. He was a machinist, and, he was curious because this didn't seem to have any, seams or bolts or anything on it. It's one, metallic sheen to it. And he thought, well, this must be some sort of American secret landing, something or other, because this was just after Apollo had started up, as a matter of fact. The tragic Apollo 1, which wasn't really Apollo 1, where astronauts were killed on the launch pad, was in the news just a matter of months before that. It was very widely known the Americans were going to the moon. Maybe this was their landing device that they were testing, and it went off course or broke down, and it happened to end up in Canada. So he was watching this for some time. He got brave enough, because he figured, well, this must be an American secret flying vehicle. And he noticed that a little of a door opened in the side of it. And there was light streaming out, and he could hear some voices, high, squeaky voices. He couldn't understand what they were, but he was convinced that they were American. So he actually stood up from where he'd been crouching behind this rock and shouted, "Okay, Yankee boys, come on out. I can help fix your broken down flying machine." But the voices stopped, and that made him stop, and he thought, oh, wait a minute, not American, Russian. Because this was during the Cold War, and maybe these were the Russians that were sort of secretly in Canada. So he called out to them in Russian because he happened to be multilingual. No response. He tried a couple of other languages, Italian, German, so forth. Nothing. And he walked right up to this thing, and he says that he touched the side of it. And he had to draw his hand away. He was wearing a rubberized glove, but the rubberized glove had started to melt because this thing was really hot. And he pulled his hand away, and when he pulled his hand away, the entire thing seemed to rotate, and there was an exhaust vent right in front of him. Suddenly, a blast of hot gas hit him in the chest, set his clothes on fire, set fire to pine needles and leaves that were on the ground, and the thing took off and flew away. Now, there's a lot more to that, but eventually he made it back to civilization, made it to a hospital where he was examined by emergency room doctors. And then later, after he was sent home, he was examined by his own doctor and a number of other doctors. We actually have the medical records, so we know this actually happened. And as word got out, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Royal Canadian Air Force took an interest in the case and did their own investigations. So we have investigations by official government agencies and military agencies. They interviewed him quite a bit. They interviewed his family. They actually went to Falcon Lake to the hotel where he'd stayed overnight the night before. They interrogated the bartender, the cleaning staff, people who'd been in the area. They went to his place of work. They took Geiger counter readings of his basement the site was eventually found. He eventually was able to direct them to where this thing had gone down. They found a big, patch of where the dirt had been swirled away or swept away from this rock. And there was some radiation found at the site. As a matter of fact, the radiation was at a high enough level that the government considered closing the entire provincial park off to the public in the middle of the summer, which would, have gone noticed for sure. It was intensely investigated. And we have all the documents. We have the interrogation report. We have the analysis of the radiation and the materials that were found. There actually had found when his clothes had caught on fire, he tore his shirt off. His shirt was actually found at the site, and it was retrieved, and it's been preserved. We actually have that in a museum here in Canada, along with a hat that he had worn, which is burned in one part. And the following year, and then the story doesn't stop there. The following year, after he had healed from his burns and recovered from a number of injuries, he went out with a friend sort of a year after, sort of as a commemoration or an anniversary, back to the site to see, how it changed over the year. And he and his friend were at the site, and they realized this was where the radiation was found. Well, they found the radiation on top, but was anything inside the rock, So there was a crack in the rock, and they dug down into the crack in the rock, and they found pieces of molten silver that were radioactive in the crack in the rock over which this thing had hovered or landed. And that metal was analyzed. And we hear a lot about metamaterials and things found at crash sites and whatever. These pieces of metal are never mentioned in the context of any of these reports, and yet we have the analysis. There was an analysis done by the University of Colorado, University of Arizona, some universities and metallurgical sites here in Canada. And there actually is a piece of this metal which is still preserved in a museum. And, we have everything you could possibly want in terms of a UFO case. And what's interesting is that Stefan Michalek never said that he was burned by a flying saucer and that met aliens. He never, took that next step that one would expect from some of these fantastic stories. He said, I was just, I was burned by something. I thought it was an American flying vehicle. Didn't see any little green guys or gray guys or anything. This is what happened to me. You can see my burns. Here's the metal and the shirt and the hat and so forth. And the site has been positively located, and the government recognized that this happened. Matter of fact, the Canadian government has recognized it as one of the Canada's most historic cultural sites in the entire country. It's commemorative coins. It's really quite remarkable how intense it's really quite remarkable that this is such a fantastic case and nobody knows about it.
Yeah.
Right. And so now Dan had put in the notes here that you actually grew up down the street from him, from Stan. I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Michalek, yeah.
Michalek.
It's really strange that I found out about the case like the day after it happened because I was friends with his son, who at that time was 10 years old like me. And we used to go bike riding and whatever, and I went to his house and, he came out to see me and said, I can't go anywhere. He's in the hospital or, I can't go today. And, that was how we kept in touch from time to time. But when I had started doing my astronomy degree and I started talking with people who had seen UFOs, it occurred to me I knew somebody who had had a close encounter. And I went and talked with him and interviewed him and got to talk with him and the family, which is quite significant because they had stopped talking to media at all. I mean, they were not interested in publicity. They had said enough is enough. But because they knew me, I was allowed to, be part of the inner circle. As a matter of fact, when Unsolved Mysteries did the segments on the show on this particular case, they flew me down to the NBC set as well. And so I got to be part of the later fallout from all the interesting aspects of the case.
That's super cool.
Super cool.
Just a little bit of history there, Chris. Thank you. And I'm fairly sure at 10 years old, that makes you probably one of the youngest ufologists to walk the earth.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'm an elder statesman right now, I suppose. Yeah.
So let me get this right. The Sky Canada UFO report and project. Would you mind just explaining to people what it is, how often the report is released, and who are the science kind of communities involved in that?
Sure. I have to clarify, there's the Canadian UFO Survey, which I began in 1989. That was simply because I wanted to know, how many cases there really were being reported. I mean, we'd been watching tabloid TV and stuff in magazines and so forth, but I wanted to know, are there, different areas of the country that had more? And of the cases, are more red lights seen than blue lights? And that type of thing. Are there more seen at 11 o'clock at night than 1 o'clock in the morning? So I got in contact with colleagues across the country, and I said, can we share our data? And I received fairly good cooperation from people across the country, and we started compiling this annual study. And I think the first year we had something like 145 cases in Canada, but not bad. And then as the study went on year after year, in fact, we were encouraged to keep it on because there had been no national study like this before, and people wanted to know what were the real, data points. Yeah. People familiar with reading the books and the magazines, but what were people really seeing? And were there, as I mentioned, more early in the morning or late at night, and what cities or towns had the most? So we began doing this, and it seemed to be a valuable resource, and we were asked to continue it by people in the UFO community. So since 1989, we kept this up, and we've kept it up to the present time. And since 1989, we have something like 26 or 27,000 separate cases reported in Canada that were either submitted, and in many cases investigated. Which is actually more than Project Blue Book even had. It's an interesting resource. We've made it freely available. The data is freely available to the public to take a look at. There's a push right now for the scientific community to look at hard data. Reports are not necessarily hard data, but you can glean some information from it. The other thing that you sort of mentioned, the Sky Canada project, is a government program that's fairly recent, started in about 2022, under the Office of Canada's Chief Science Advisor, partly in response to what's been going on in the United States, partly from the pressure from some politicians. And so they produced a report just last year, which I was one of the advisors on, looking at what Canada has done in the past with regard to UFO research and studies at a government and military level, and what should be done moving forward. Now, there have been a number of recommendations that the Canadian government had suggested, and the Chief Science Advisor reports directly to the Prime Minister. So, in theory, the Prime Minister is taking this into account with some suggestions. And one of the most interesting things that's arisen just in June of this year is that Canada has increased its military presence in the Arctic, and has signed some agreements on detection of incursions into North American airspace, which is exactly some of the stuff that had been talked about over the years. So, there are all these things happening all together, and, we're moving, sort of as at the forefront of a lot of UAP research right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much in what you just spoke about as well, in terms of how to kind of take that data and inform people about what's going on and inform the government. Really, if it's being reported to the Prime Minister, you guys are essentially ahead of where America has been for the past couple of years, right?
I think so, and I think we're being more transparent. One of the most interesting things that we have is through my research and collaboration with other researchers, and through in Canada we call them access to information requests. In the United States, it's freedom of information requests, asking the government to release some documents, and we've managed to obtain a fairly complete record of UFOs reported in Canada from 1947 to the present time, which is significant because the United States, Project Blue Book ran, between Grudge and Sign and so forth from about the 1940s to about 1969 when they issued the Condon Report. And after that point, between 1970, let's say, and 2015, when we found out that there had been some projects in the 20-aughts in 2005 and 7 and so forth, there's really this big gap, this black hole that we have no idea what the United States military or government were doing with regard to UFOs. But Canada has a complete record of that period, and we have many, many cases and documentations above and beyond the 26,000 that I just mentioned, because this goes back before then, of cases that were reported through the military by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, by air traffic controllers, by pilots, and so forth. So we have all of those cases that are largely unknown.
Wow. And after analyzing those, Chris, like taking a look through those cases over the years, were there any patterns that stood out to you or surprised you in terms of what you saw there?
Well, for the period between 89 and the present, there are some interesting patterns that emerge. For example, the peak time for UFO sightings is 11 o'clock at night, not 1 o'clock in the morning when the bars let out, but 11 o'clock at night. And the peak times, the times of the year, it's summer. It's pretty darned hot right now, so you'd think people would be out enjoying summer and watching the skies and being out at their cabins or out at the lake. The peak month for UFO reports in Canada is actually August, which in parts of Canada is already starting to get pretty cool. So why that is so and why it's not June and July, we're not sure. And even in the winter months, there still are, quite a number of cases that are being reported. In fact, in the middle of winter, January, for example, there are, significant numbers of cases, almost, about half as many as in the summer, which is a little strange. And you can go from there to the number of witnesses per case. Turns out that it's not just one person standing by him or herself in a field looking up saying, wow, that's some UFO there. It's somebody who, for example, is driving or sitting outside looking at the stars, sees something and elbows the person next to him or her and says, are you seeing that too? And they say yes. The average number of witnesses per case is close to 2, on the average going across all the cases. So it means that it's not just one person. It's usually, witnessed by a couple of people who can testify to each other's sighting. So these are the types of things that come out when you look at the raw data. And again, it's not the type of data that scientists are necessarily looking for. They're looking for instrumented data, recorded data, photographs, radar, all that sort of stuff. In many cases, these are witnesses who report what they've seen. And in some cases, they can be corroborated, in some cases not. But this is what's being actually reported by witnesses. And that, I think, is sort of the foundation upon which all of ufology is based.
In an effort to kind of guide our listeners to perhaps somewhere they can see a UFO, is there a particular place that's more of a, I guess, I don't like the term, a hotspot, as kind of Keel would have called it?
Well, yes and no. We found that, for example, the areas that have the most population have more sightings. Now, that's intuitive because if there's more people around and something is seen, you'll get more witnesses around potentially to see something. So, for example, there are more people in Canada, in Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver, so we get more cases from there. That doesn't mean we don't get reports from sparsely populated areas, and that would be the true of the United States as well. More people around in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago than in the middle of nowhere, but there are cases in between. And yet, if you look at it statistically, and go by population, there are some areas that seem to have lower populations but have more cases than they should based on statistics. And in Canada, those include Eastern Canada, the Atlantic provinces, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and in the West, perhaps some areas in Alberta and Saskatchewan that have smaller populations, but they seem to have more reports than they should. Now, why that is so, it's really hard to tell. But it's interesting. These are the types of things that pop out or tease out when you're trying to do some analysis of the cases.
Yeah, it's always fun to kind of look into the patterns and to see, is it the kind of mountain ranges running down? I've experienced the Brown Mountain lights and also lights in Colombia, where it turns out it's kind of part of the same edge of the tectonic plate, So it's interesting to look into these things. But I'm curious, you touched on Blue Book already, and I know with Blue Book there was a percentage of kind of unknowns that they ended up with. What was your percentage of unknowns?
That's a really good question. Yeah, Blue Book had, I think, some of the earlier reports had something like 18% unexplained. We've brought that down quite a bit. Maybe we're better at investigating than Air Force officers. But we brought that down.
You're doing it properly.
Somewhere below 5%. So out of every year, there's, a few percentage of cases that don't seem to have easy explanations. Now, that doesn't mean that they'll never be explained. And it doesn't mean that those are aliens. It just means that, they don't seem to be aircraft, stars, planes, satellites, and so forth. But even that number, let's say, a few percent out of, and in Canada, the number is something like 1,000 separate UFO reports every year. So if you're looking at 1 or 2% of 1,000 times, what are we now, 35 years of the Canadian UFO Survey or more, you're looking at several hundred cases which are curious. And we're Canada in terms of population, in terms of UFO reports, is about 10%. So, the 10 times that number for the United States. So, there's a lot of cases out there.
Yeah, I think Blue Book ended up with just over 700 unknowns by the time it was done. So it's interesting, you're not actually that far off percentage-wise and case number-wise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also Canada has, so much sky, right? And our density is so low compared to that of the U.S. You would almost think there would be more, or that, I don't know, but maybe it's because our population is close to the U.S. border or not so densely populated north.
Yeah, most of Canada's population lives within, 100 miles of the U.S. border. So, there's a lot of empty space up there. But we do get cases from the north. In fact, some very interesting incursions have been reported in the north over the years. In fact, some really famous cases where things get shot down.
I actually have a question about that coming up. So I'll hold it. I'll hand over to Ross for her question here. But yeah, we'll come back.
I was like, that's a tease. That's a tease right there. Okay, Chris, so we wanted to ask you, one thing that's unique about Canada is that there was never a huge public program like Project Blue Book. But we do have Project Magnet, which I do not know much about. And I would love to hear you tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think a lot of people have heard of the term Project Magnet in one way or another, but don't know much about it. I'm going to be elaborating on this at the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies conference at the end of July, because it although many people think or have this idea that Project Magnet was Canada's secret UFO project, it actually wasn't. There was one called Project Second Story, which was a little bit after that in the 1950s, which was an official government project investigating the possibility of what's going on with UFOs. And there have been some after that. Project Magnet was a study by one person named Wilbert Smith, and he was a telecommunications technician. He had a master's in electrical engineering. And in the early 1950s, he took an interest in UFOs and flying saucers. And he sort of pulled a fast one on the government. He was interested in the subject and wanted to get permission to study them with some government funding. So he asked if he could study the possibility of electromagnetism as a propulsion, as a way of flying aircraft, because he thought that electromagnetism was one way that flying saucers were able to fly in the sky. So he got them to agree to give him a small observation station and allowed him to use used equipment in a small little hut on one of the research facilities. And didn't really elaborate that this was to study and detect flying saucers, and that was his pet project, Project Magnet. But even he admitted that it didn't do anything. It was given up, gave up the ghost after a few years. But what happened was he was frustrated because the government wasn't supporting him as much as he thought. So he actually contacted a fellow by the name of Donald Kehoe, who wrote a number of books on flying saucers in the United States. And Kehoe actually devoted an entire chapter in one of his books to Wilbert Smith and Project Magnet, and that really set the tone, that Canada has this big secret project, even though it was just Wilbert Smith by himself. It really didn't accomplish very much at all. In fact, Project Second Story, which was in the same department practically, they had meetings and they grudgingly invited Wilbert Smith to attend. In fact, the story goes they didn't even invite him to some of their meetings. So there's a whole list of things that are problems with that, the Project Second Story investigations were very, very minimal. They looked at a few cases, but they really took their cue from the United States with grudge and so forth, decided there really wasn't much going on. And yet, the Department of National Defense and the Air Force continued to investigate cases as a matter of course until about 1967. And in that year, they decided that flying saucers, or by that time they started to call them UFOs, really don't belong with the military. They belong with science, perhaps. And let the scientists take a look at them, because one of the prevailing ideas in the National Research Council of Canada at the time is that some of the reports of UFOs turned out to be reports of meteors and fireballs. And there was this, keen sense that maybe if we had enough reports of UFOs, of things falling to the ground, maybe some of them would be meteorites, and those are actually valuable for scientific research. So the National Research Council of Canada said, okay, let's accept reports from the Canadian public, went public stating that they're interested in UFO reports, and people started reporting UFOs to the National Research Council of Canada. The problem with the National Research Council of Canada is that it's based in Ottawa, and people were seeing UFOs in Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Newfoundland, and what do? Well, Canada has a built-in departmental office or series of offices right across the country. It's called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So the National Research Council of Canada actually hired or made an arrangement with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to investigate UFOs in Canada on their behalf and send the reports to Ottawa. So from 1967 to 1995, almost 30 years, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigated UFOs in Canada. And we have most of those records available. Some were very intense. I mentioned in Falcon Lake, it was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who investigated that case. But they investigated right up until 1995. And those records have been studied. We found many of them. I have thousands of them. And almost 10,000 of those reports are available now in the records in the Archives of Canada and the Libraries and Archives Canada. So it's very interesting that we have this record as well. And then in 1995, when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, backed off a little bit, and we're not really into the UFO investigation business, it was taken over by Transport Canada in some ways. But what happened was they found out about me, and and it's a little embarrassing.
Oh no!
Actually, because I was actually because I was an astronomer working, here in Manitoba, but I had gone to Ottawa. And I had been to the National Research Council and met with some of the people who were accepting the UFO reports from the public. And they said, we have to get out of the UFO business. It's just not our thing. And I jokingly said, well, you can always send the reports to me. And so in about 1996, 97, somewhere in there, I had a phone call from a military officer who said, are you the guy we're supposed to be sending UFO reports to? And I said, sure. And I started getting UFO reports from the military, from pilots, from you name it, from the general public as well. And so that lasted until the 2020s or so. Because I'd been involved in working with advising and talking with scientists and military officers and pilots and so forth for these years, and putting out the Canadian UFO survey, I guess they figured I was no slouch, and that's why they called upon me as an advisor for the Sky Canada project. And since then, I've been approached by politicians. I gave a presentation to a senator. I was asked by members of Parliament to give presentations, and the interest is there. Kind of in the shadow of what's going on in the United States, but it's still going on, and we have a greater record and greater transparency because we have these files, and I've been making these files available all along, and it shows that Canada has been more involved in the UFO scene than most people realize.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's so interesting to me because when you're talking about these Mounties who are charged with investigating UFOs across Canada for something like 20 years, I mean, that to me is like a television show. Like, I feel like, that should be a Netflix series. Like, it's just a hilarious premise, number one, and also fascinating. But, my question is like, why do you think in Canada it has not kind of invaded the zeitgeist here? Like, we do not have a national sense of this subject and our place in it, unlike the US, where you can really easily kind of follow this timeline, all the way from Roswell on down. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, Chris? I'm curious. It's a bigger kind of cultural question, but I feel the stories are there. Why don't we tell them? Why don't we share them? I don't know.
Well, that's a good question. And I guess what I can say is that I think, because, the fire hose of what's happening down in the United States has been so predominant. It's hard to rise above what's happening in the United States by looking at Canadian stuff. Similarly, I mean, I can point to Great Britain, and they've had some, Ministry of Defense releases of UFO reports, and other countries have been greatly interested. France, for example, is been moving ahead in this regard as well, and other countries as well. I guess the other thing is, what can I do? This is my 11th book on UFOs is coming out in July.
Do more, Chris. Do more.
And so, my name's not Stephen King, so if you have one or the other, which one are you going to take, right? So, there are lots of, and I've had many people ahead of me, a number of Canadians. A fellow by the name of John Brent Musgrave actually got a Canada Council grant to publish a book on UFOs back, many decades ago. We've had the UFO landing pad in St. Paul, Alberta, which is hosting a big party this July. And people may have heard of Shag Harbor, where there's actually a museum and a great investigation out there, and they're having conferences as well too. So it's certainly not to the extent that the United States has, but Canada is no slouch in this regard. And maybe it's just maybe it's because a podcast of your quality has not been covering Canada enough.
Amazing.
Love it.
Now people are going to find out. They're going to say, "Absolutely, Roz and Dan have a
Your check is in the mail, Chris.
I like that.
Thank you." So you touched on something really interesting there about the Mounties, where you're looking at essentially outlier data to try and find like meteors and things like that and accepting there's going to be some weird stuff in this report. And the US over the past few years has kind of had a similar trajectory. And there's been a lot of kind of conversation about this threat narrative where, you know, the US is clearly looking at the outliers because this is where modern warfare and drone warfare is going now. And that's where the UFOs are too. So we kind of have to go through that. But there was a moment in 2023, early 2023, when the US decided it was NORAD, they said, we're going to open our filters and see what's out there. And they found several objects. Many of them got shut down. Many of them are unidentified. There was one up in the Yukon. And it was one of the moments for me where I was like, whoa, the US and Canada are like really working together on this, tracking the anomalous and figuring out the anomalous. So I guess two questions on this is, one, do you think Canada is involved in any kind of US UFO legacy program? And two, what did you make of that moment where the shootdowns happened over the Yukon and, you know, working with Canada?
Interesting. I was just having a discussion about the legacy program issue with somebody earlier today. But let me address the whole Yukon thing first. So 2023, where this Chinese balloon passed over the United States and was eventually shot down off the East Coast. It was tracked from, they talk about Montana and then eventually over the rest of the United States, but it was actually seen over Canada first. In fact, we do have reports from pilots who had seen it over British Columbia. That was a fairly large object. We have some very good records of what was seen. And they did recover large pieces, and they were able. I think there's rumors that they were able to recover some data from it. And because they had detected this, it was very interesting. That they were actually using the term UFO. CNN and Fox were both calling it a UFO, and to have mainstream news talk about UFOs, that was quite spectacular. And what had happened, because the balloon, the Chinese balloon, was moving very, very slowly, NORAD tracks everything, but the automated tracking system ignores stuff that's moving too slow because they're interested in missiles and aircraft and all that sort of stuff. Balloons, no big deal, really. But then they said, well, after the Chinese balloon, let's look at everything. And suddenly when they, set their filters differently, they detected a whole bunch of other things. They detected this one thing that was off I think the first one was Beaufort Sea, and that was shot down, and then Yukon, and that was shot down, and then Lake Huron, and that was shot down. What happened was that they were shot down and by a joint NORAD contingent. Canada's partners with the United States and NORAD. Canadian jets and American jets are both up there at the same time. As a matter of fact, NORAD switches commanders from Canadian to American every so often. It turned out it was a Canadian commander who was actually in charge of the shoot down during that period. But it was an American jet that shot down the ones that were in the far north. We don't know a lot about what went on during those shoot downs, except that because of the Canadian access to information requests that a number of people have filed, we've been managed to look at something like 500 pages of documentation about the thing that was shot down over the Yukon. Just that one. In addition, there were documents including a briefing for Canada's Prime Minister regarding that, in which it was described as UAP 23. It was advising Canada's Prime Minister of what was being done and how it was being tracked, and how the Americans were going to use various aircraft to shoot it down, and what do you do on the ground, and what type of recovery operation, and how do you communicate to the media. All of this is in documentation that was obtained in Canada. Not a single page of documentation has been produced and released for the United States, what the United States was doing. So there's some strange things there. But among the the documents that, for example, the one that was talking to or released for information for Canada's Prime Minister, where it mentioned UAP 23, there was also a mention of UAP 20, which was another one of the things that were shot down. And through requests, it turned out that they number them consecutively from the beginning of the year. That meant that there had been 23 objects that were detected by NORAD over North America between January and March of 2023. Just that period. And if you extrapolate to the rest of the year,
amazing.
There were 200 or perhaps 300 objects that were tracked that we have no information about whatsoever. So we do know that NORAD is keeping closer track of what's going on. We do know that the objects that were shot down probably were balloons, and people are saying, well, how come nothing was ever recovered? Well, they were shot down with Sidewinder missiles, and when you use a 10-foot Sidewinder missile to shoot down a balloon that's only 10 feet in diameter, taper thin, there ain't going to be much of that balloon left to recover. Now, just over the past few months, there have been some documents that I've seen obtained by somebody else that said that some material was found on the ground, but it was pretty small amounts. So, we do know that there is a recovery operation, and you do hear about crash recovery materials and NHI materials and all this sort of stuff. There actually are crash recovery programs in place, not necessarily for your UFOs and UAP, but for other objects. The most significant case happened in, I think it was 1979 or was it 1980, in the Canadian Arctic, where a Russian satellite called Cosmos 954 re-entered Earth's atmosphere unexpectedly and crashed into the Canadian Arctic. This was a problem because Cosmos 954 had a nuclear reactor on board. And when it crashed, the nuclear radiation was spread out across a large swath in the Canadian Arctic. There had to be some remediation. Particles were found as small as a pinhead to as large as a piece of the reactor the size of a refrigerator. All of this was recovered. There was a search and recovery operation, and there are documents and reports on the search and recovery operation. So we know that there is an existing search and recovery operation or search and recovery process that is, well established. So when I hear about, crash retrieval programs regarding UAP, and people are vague about what's being done, and who's in charge and so forth, what department, well, we know exactly what's being done because it's been documented many times before. And if we don't see that with regard to the claims of UAP, my question is, why not?
All right. So on the heels of that, Chris, I wanted to ask you, this is our fun question. If you had unrestricted access to one Canadian government archive, what would you want to see? Unrestricted.
Unrestricted. Well, there's one government department that we really don't have much information on, and that's NAV Canada. Now, it's not technically a government department. It is a non-governmental organization, but it is the department where pilots report their UFOs to, and NAV Canada then sends the information on to Transport Canada. So we get information from Transport Canada on what pilots have reported, but only in very abbreviated form. NAV Canada actually gets the UFO reports themselves. So we don't have any information on that. And because it's a non-government organization, we can't even file an access to information request for it. So, there's this one piece of the pie that we don't have information on, and that would be one to get.
And how about outside of the classics that we've already touched on, like Shag Harbor and Falcon Lake? Which Canadian cases do you think deserve a spotlight more?
Cases? Well, you mentioned Falcon Lake and Shag Harbor. I would include one called Langenberg, which was 1973, I think, where a farmer had said that he had found swirled patterns in his crops. This is before crop circles. And they were found here in Canada before anywhere else. It was investigated by the RCMP. The National Research Council has an extensive record. We have all those files. The witness was, interviewed many times. He is unavailable now, but his family has talked to very recently, it's a very interesting case. Again, it predates crop circles because these swirls were found in the crop, which is interesting because even that case is predated by a case from 1967 called Duhamel, Alberta, where rings were found in a field, and the Royal Canadian Air Force investigated, calling it a UFO landing trace, although no UFOs were seen. And we have a report from the Royal Canadian Air Force on that case. But obviously something, of that significance, must have had further documentation. So, we've had some interesting cases over the years. More recently, we've had cases in British Columbia where, discs have been seen moving in the sky. In Alberta in 1967, oddly enough. And there was an interesting radar case in Manitoba in 1967. So there's a whole series of reports that we simply don't have enough information on.
That's super cool. And yeah, you're right, because the crop circles in England, there were two guys that come forward and said, we've been doing these since the 80s, and we're coming forward and telling you now, but obviously, another continent, much harder to travel around back then, and way predates that. So that's really interesting. It makes me think of the cargo cult idea that was presented in, I think it was Secret Machines, where we see these things in the sky and we try and kind of copy, similar to what happened in the Pacific Theater, where the US forces would set up bases on these islands, and then they'd come back and the natives had built kind of radio towers out of bamboo and airstrips, really rudimentary, trying to copy. So maybe the crop circles we see today are kind of like that. We're just mimicking these original things.
Could be.
So, Chris, I wanted to ask you about, obviously Canada has such a rich Indigenous history, and because you are our de facto Canadian UFO expert here, I'm wondering if in all of your time collecting reports, have you encountered any interesting cases or, conversations with Indigenous communities that really challenged your assumptions or expanded the way you think about the phenomenon?
Well, my first book was titled Unnatural History. It's my second book. But in that, I discussed a lot of Indigenous mysteries, such as petroforms and petroglyphs, and some of the spiritual experiences. In doing so, I ended up speaking with a lot of Indigenous people. Now, even today, I get reports from Indigenous people who, on their First Nations, have seen UFOs. So that's, neither here nor there. It's just, part of the number of people who have seen things. But going back about 10 or 15 years now, I was approached by a television network called APTN, Aboriginal Broadcasting Network. And they had done a series of shows. It was a UFO TV series called Indians and Aliens. I think it ran 2 or 3 seasons. I was on a couple of the seasons. But what happened was the producer of the series had taken an interest because in the far north of Quebec, and a lot of First Nations, as Hydro-Quebec had created, some roads and better communication all the way up to the Arctic, they had encountered Indigenous peoples who had said that they had seen some objects in the sky. And in some cases, these were described as spirits, sky dragons, omens, lights moving in the sky that, had premonition of something or other. And so they actually created a TV series talking with a lot of Indigenous people who had reported and had experienced cases like that. And so, there is a definite component to this. And I was approached about 2 years ago now by an Indigenous elder who wanted to know what astronomical objects were in the sky on a certain date about 1,000 years ago in a certain location in Canada, because there had been an indigenous tradition that the elders from the sky had come down in silver platforms to impart knowledge to the Indigenous people. And I was able to, to connect some of the dots there and, find some connection. But that part of our culture is still largely untapped, I think. There's no question that there is a spiritual component. From a scientific background, I'm more interested in the, the nuts and bolts stuff. But at the same time, we can't ignore the more spiritual aspects of all this and the profound effect that having a UFO experience has on the witness. So we do have to recognize that and understand that there is a humanistic component, because the observer is human, and people interpret sightings in different ways, interpret their experiences in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I always think of this when I'm watching sports and, you get a replay of like a foul or something and everyone's arguing, even though you can see in slow motion, 60 frames per second, everyone's seeing different things in the same clip. So when it comes to UFOs, you often get reports that kind of differ person to person. And it's really interesting that spiritual component is there in the Indigenous kind of, oral tradition, because now I think that spiritual component has kind of become the consciousness component of this conversation. Yeah. What do you think of that?
Yeah, indeed. In fact, in my working on historical data, the earliest records that I found in Canada of objects that might be considered UFOs date back to, I think it's 1692, over what's now Montreal, where some of the explorers and missionaries from a colonial period, of course, had been with some of the Indigenous peoples in that area and had reported sky dragons, these flaming objects moving in the sky. And then we can even fast forward to 1792 here in Manitoba, where David Thompson, who's a colonial explorer, was with a guide, and he and the guide had seen in what is now Thicket Portage in northern Canada what he was described as a globular meteor that fell to the earth and made a gelatinous sound of bleh, sort of something like that as it fell onto the frozen lake. And they had seen a second one a few days later. So we do have, contemporary versus historical accounts of objects in the sky, definitely related to Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, and Ivan T. Sanderson does a big study on these kind of sky jellies that fall, to the point where he posited that some of these craft were actually, life forms that were rare and lived in our atmosphere or in space. So that's really interesting. It goes back that far. Okay. So right now, there's enormous excitement coming out of the USA with whistleblowers, supposed disclosure from Trump. Thus far, we haven't really got any hard evidence. I wanted to get your thoughts on what's going on in the US, that process, and, if you have any reservations about how it's being handled, what you change.
Yeah, I have to admit I have some issues with the whole whistleblower thing. When I think of whistleblowers, I think of Karen Silkwood. I think of Erin Brockovich. I think of Daniel Ellsberg. And the difference between them and the UAP whistleblowers is pretty easy. All of those that I mentioned, there was documentation. In the case of Silkwood, we had the radioactive material. In the case of Brockovich, they had the poisonous materials in the land. And Ellsberg, we actually had the documents. We don't have any of that with the whistleblowers. There's no documentation. We have claims. We have stories. We have whistleblowers who say that they've seen pieces of whatever, or they've been in a skiff or whatever where this has been discussed. But we don't have anything that's accessible. So that's a big difference. And I don't even like using the term whistleblower when I think of the UAP, because these are people who are making claims that can't be verified. Now, does that mean they're lying? No. What it tells us is, maybe there's a different process involved, but we just don't have enough information. And that's why I think there's a knee-jerk reaction from the scientific community. For example, the Galileo Project, Dr. Avi Loeb, and his scientific program out of Harvard, which I'm part of, by the way, and in the attempt to actually, use scientific instrumentation to gather data on objects in the sky. Right now, the Galileo Project is essentially training AI to identify objects that they have been detecting in the sky. There's possibly as many as 1 million objects now that they've detected. They're trying to triangulate and so forth. But it's hard to train an AI to tell the difference between a UAP and a bird if it's flying in the daytime sky.
Right. But we don't know what a UAP looks like technically, right? So we can't say to AI, this is what you're looking for.
Right. So I think because we just don't have enough information, all these claims, that we don't have enough evidence, and I would say incontrovertible evidence, that's why the scientific community is taking a more active role in this. And that's why the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies is having its conference in Toronto at the end of July to try and bring together scientists to take a better look at the UAP phenomenon. So yes, we have on one hand, these people who are in, who had been in positions of where they, would have had access to information about UAP in the intelligence community and military community and so forth. But we just don't have the proof and the evidence that what they're looking at was true. I mean, maybe they were involved in crash retrieval programs like Operation Morning Light that looked, the same one that recovered the Cosmos 954. There's also another case in northern Saskatchewan in about 1968, 70. I can't even remember the dates now, where something was described as a piece of a UFO was found near Wollaston, Saskatchewan. It was about, 4 or 5 feet across, made of titanium and so forth. That's a big chunk of something. And in Canada in 1960, a 1-ton piece of metal was found on the shore of the Ottawa River and analyzed by people who thought it was a piece of a spacecraft. There are these objects and pieces of things that you never hear about because people are focused on these little tiny pieces of metamaterials. The one that gets all the attention are about the size of a dime. So I think that people should basically open their eyes and take their filters off to look at the subject from a broader sense than just pop ufology. And that's what's getting a lot of attention right now. I call it pop ufology because it's gee whiz, it's sensational. It's the aliens are here, they're communicating with us and so forth. But we just don't have the incontrovertible proof and evidence that's really happening. So I'd like to see a better dialogue between the scientific community and pop ufology, but it's really difficult to get the two sides talking to each other.
Yeah, I guess it's easier for Spielberg to make Disclosure Day than it is for him to get actual material from the Legacy program and hand it to us, right?
Yeah. And, Spielberg admits that he took a lot of the information from pop ufology, and that's why a lot of people are relating to it. That's the same type of alien that I saw. Well, but it's science fiction, so how could that possibly be?
Sure. The Science Advisory Board, I just want to touch on this because you said you're working with Avi, and I'd love to kind of get your thought on it. It's recently been announced that he's running a Science Advisory Board for the U.S. administration, for the Trump administration. And I read that they're doing that without any NDAs, without any access to classified material. Do you think that's going to get further than something like the SEU and the work you've done, or do you think it's just going to be more of the same?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm hoping that it's going to get a little bit further. I mean, Avi's reputation for the Galileo project, at least in the project that he's working on and getting, he has a good team. There's really sharp people, including graduate students, who are putting together these devices themselves and testing them and, constructing the triangulation and all that sort of stuff. There's a really smart team there. And then he's also gathered together some of these scientists who haven't had the background with UAP necessarily. Maybe they've never investigated a UFO case before, but because they can apply science to UAP, and that's a good approach, they're involved in this. But because they don't have necessarily access, and I think the quote is that they don't have access to a lot of the classified materials, are they really going to make any progress? And, my counter is that the Galileo project doesn't have access. My own access to classified material is pretty limited. At one time, I did have had some access to classified material. I actually did have a government program fund, something I was working on, but that was many years ago. But you do have to have access to this information, and maybe the scientists on board of the UAP group that Avi is going to be leading might be able to get access from, let's say, satellite data from NASA. And some of the commercial companies. We actually tried that already, and one of the projects I was involved with, Galileo, was looking at satellite images looking for UFOs. Unfortunately, the resolutions weren't necessarily there, but maybe there's some classified material that do have good resolution, and maybe they'll have access to it. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I wish they had asked me to be on it. Come on, guys. But,
you certainly won't work. I would put you on.
Yeah, but maybe it'll produce something. And I, as I said, I was an advisor to the Sky Canada project, even though I'm not a government employee. So maybe there's some aspects that can be teased out of this information.
Amazing. So, Chris, we're going to switch gears, take you back to the Canada questions to start to close us out.
Okay.
First question being, do you think disclosure is even possible in Canada, or has Canada already disclosed as much as it can?
I think Canada has already made great advances in disclosure. In fact, for me, the fact that I, had access to military reports, including secret documents showing UFO cases, that we've had a complete record of National Research Council and RCMP investigations going back since the 40s, and we've had good relationships with Transport Canada. We've talked with many pilots. Plus, we've had a number of politicians who have come forward with interest in the UFOs, and they've been on public record stating that we think the government should be more transparent, that there should be an investigation. In fact, the Sky Canada project has said they want the Canadian government to set up an office where people can report UFOs. They want the media to be more to work with investigations and researchers on the UFO question. They want post-secondary institutions, universities and colleges to teach about UAP. I mean, this is exactly what disclosure is all about. The capital D disclosure, that there's an organization that is trickling out the information bit by bit. Well, they're not doing a very good job of keeping a lid on it, because we've been finding out information on it all along. In fact, we get cases all the time from military personnel, and even in the United States, the famous FLIR and Go Fast and so forth. We've had that data for years now. So they're not doing a very good job of keeping a lid on it. And pure research itself is moving ahead. Scientific scholarly articles on UFOs and UAP have been published for many, many years. In fact, on one of my blogs, I publish a list of all the scientific and scholarly articles that I've found on the subject of UAP, and there's literally hundreds upon hundreds of them. And even the New York Times article that seemed to have blown the lid off of the UAP stuff in 2015 had many precedents. There were many articles, if you search through the New York Times, talking seriously about UFOs and UAP going back decades before then. So I don't think everything started recently, and I think that Canada has been definitely at the forefront and is more transparent. As I mentioned, we have hundreds of documents about what went on in northern Canada, and not a single shred of evidence of what's happened up there from the United States government. In fact, we found briefings for the Canadian Minister of National Defense on UFOs. In fact, various ministers, because we've had several over the past decade. We found all the material that were presented to these ministers. We don't have anything comparable for Pete Hegseth. We don't have anything comparable to the President of the United States. But we have, material that was presented to the Canadian Prime Minister. So I would say that Canada is way ahead in terms of transparency, way ahead of disclosure. And I think people should be taking more notice of what's going on north of the border.
I love that. I agree.
Pick it up and drop it. Like that was
mic drop.
The power. Yeah. Well done, Chris. Thank you.
What is your report card? So that you're university, right? You've been in the university world. What would your report card be for Canada on disclosure?
Oh, I would have to give us. I would give us an A-, because there's still much more to be done, and there are certainly, as I mentioned, NAV Canada and compartmentalization, and I think the scientific community, is getting there, but needs a little more work.
I love that. That's great. I love that you gave it a -. That is very scholarly of you. I love that. And, do you have any, after all of your years studying the subject, is there anything, would there be anything that you feel more convinced of today than you were when you started?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I have to say that when I started, in the 70s, I was a little more wide-eyed and gee whiz, and boy, this kind of stuff is cool. And the more I looked at it, I realized, that's not necessarily as advertised. And, as I found, there was less, or there was more ambiguity than I'd like. So I think I've become not more skeptical. I always had that level of skepticism. But I'm objective, perhaps, in that sense. I believe that, how would I phrase this best? It's good to have an open mind with regard to UAP and UFOs, but not so open that your brains fall out. And I would add the corollary that as you're walking, you have to watch where you're stepping, because there's a lot of gray matter on the sidewalk.
And for Canadians, that's
gray matter.
For Canadians or anybody looking to research more of Canada's illustrious history, as you've done such an amazing job of pointing out for us throughout this whole interview, where should they go? Where would you recommend they go? You mentioned you have a blog people should look at. Where else?
I've got a blog. I have 11 books out, and I think at least a half dozen are still in print. The one before this one was confidential Canadian UFOs, but this next one is called Canada's UFO Secrets. It's going to be officially published on July the 14th. And I have other books. I've been involved in ufology for many years. I have a blog which is ufology research at Blogspot. And I'm the Canadian UFO Survey is CanadianUFOReport.ca. And I've been on a number of other TV shows. One that I was on fairly recently is called UFO Point of View, POV, and I was one of the advisors on that. There are many cases on record that involve Canada more than just Falcon Lake, and I think you should keep your eyes and ears open for what's happening north of the border.
Absolutely. And a big part of that, I think, is listening to witnesses properly. And obviously, you've been doing this for decades now. What advice would you give people on how to treat witnesses better?
Well, I think listening to witnesses is certainly paramount. Sometimes I get, people who, come to me after I give a presentation and they say, can I talk with you? I want to share what I've experienced. And sometimes that's all they want. They want somebody to listen to what, they've experienced. Some, of course, want, validation. I saw an alien spaceship, didn't I? Well, I don't know. Let's talk about it. I do still teach about astronomy and our place in the universe, talking about how the possibility there's life out there. But, It's a long distance between the stars, and we're not entirely sure how that's even possible to travel like that. But there might be ways of doing it. Let's talk about it. What do aliens look like? Why would they be visiting Earth? Why would they look in a certain way? Would they actually land on the White House lawn? Not that there's a White House lawn anymore, but what would, where would the aliens go? Maybe they wouldn't go to the White House. Maybe they would go someplace else. These are types of questions that we'd have to ask, and it all goes back to what it really means to be human.
Nice.
And we have this
earning you a keep today.
Yeah, we have this idea that we wonder about our place in the universe, and the question of UFOs and aliens really focuses on that. Are we alone, and do our daily lives have any meaning in the grand scope of things? And if an alien came to Earth, what would it think of what's going down here? And is there a way to be in a better relationship with other people and be better examples of what an intelligent species is like? I sometimes talk about how, even though we're called Homo sapiens, it's hard to see sapience in a lot of what's going on. And perhaps we're looking for another level of evolution called Homo sentiens, and we should move from sapient to sentient, I think, because I think that would make a very big difference.
I like that, especially when we think of the research with like Homo naledi and how we've just found that, they're practicing burials and traditions and things that we didn't think anything before us. Precursors to humans did that, and it turns out they use fire. They do these ritual ceremonies. They have grave sites that are exclusively for female members of their families and things like that. So certainly we're going to have to redefine a little bit how we think of ourselves. And I guess we'll run into the last question there, and I'll just be very direct about this because you've already touched on it, kind of. But what do you think it means to be human, Chris?
I think it means to be aware. And, people talk about consciousness and how the aliens are trying to raise consciousness. That's actually the wrong term. A lot of things appear to have consciousness. And, by simply waking up, you have consciousness. But to be aware and really understand and contemplate, that's something else. So I'm hoping that the aliens would, be not as impressed with consciousness as they would be of our awareness of our place in the universe and maybe them.
I love that. And you've essentially landed on that final wonderful message of Disclosure Day, right? Listen to each other, be compassionate, But people, all listeners, you can find tickets for the SCU event coming up in Toronto on July 24th to 26th with Chris Mellon, Maya Cowan, Chris, Kevin Newth, Robert Powell, and many, many more awesome guests. You can get tickets for that at explorescu.org. But Chris, you've spent over 50 years looking for answers, and you're still asking just honest questions and resisting the more sensational aspects of this subject. Thank you for that. That's such a rare thing, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Spotify or on your chosen platform. If you could like, share, or subscribe, that would be very much appreciated. It helps us find our tribe. If you'd like to support the show and get access to a 1-hour live chat each month and early ad-free access, you can find us at Patreon. Just follow the link in the show notes or at our website, tobehumanshow.com. And feel free to reach out via the contact page or email at hello@tobehumanshow.com. As always, remember to be curious. The universe is bigger than we know.
What It Means to Be Human is a double-barrel production. This week's episode was produced by Roz Mugford and Dan Zetterstrom. Sound post-production by Parker Mosley with technical support from Dale Mugford. Our theme music is by Thunderbird.